che abbiamo qui Torelli Wilk, che è professore associato di musicologia all'Università Regionale di Cracovia, è uno studioso noto di musica strumentale italiana del 6 e del 700, è membro del comitato scientifico delle opere complete di Eric Wieniawski e anche il direttore della rivista Musica Regiononica fin dal 2017. E oggi ci parla appunto del fratello, quindi di Pietro Degli Antoni, con un intervento che si intitola Pietro Degli Antoni e Bolognese Sonata for solo violino.
Grazie mille, buongiorno, dzień dobry. Vorrei ringraziare anche al gruppo Arcomelo per organizzare questa interessantissima conferenza dedicata a una figura di grande importanza nella storia di musica, ma un po' dimenticata oggi. Io vorrei parlare di Pietro Degli Antoni, che è un musico ancora più dimenticato di Torelli. E come sempre succede, il fratello più giovane deve seguire il fratello più grande, allora questo cambio dei papers riflette anche questa relazione fra i fratelli degli Antoni. Non so se si vede, sì, come vedete a sinistra manca il bel ritratto di Pietro Degli Antoni, perché me l'ho rubato ieri Federico Longo, provando che era il ritratto di Attilo Arioschi. Allora restiamo privi dell'immagine del nostro musicista, ma per fortuna abbiamo la sua musica. Scusate che parlerò in inglese, ma come il mio fratello più grande parlava inglese, anch'io devo seguire il suo esempio. Before the advent of the instrumental concerto, the sonata was the most ambitious genre of instrumental music of the 17th century. It saw much experimentation in form, texture, expression, and instrumental technique. The solo sonata, otherwise known as Sonata a uno strumento, was the most important for the development of the violin idiom. Although 17th century Bologna was famous for its outstanding violinists, their works have not survived. I mean the works by Alfonso Pagani, Ercole Gaibara, Bartolomeo Laurenti, Leonardo Brugnoli, and Giovanni Benvenuti. As far as the Bolognese sonatas for solo violin are concerned, Pietro Degli Antoni left the largest number of them. He is the author of 20 violin sonatas published in two collections between 1676 and 1686. Before this period, we have only 8 sonatas by Ottavio Maria Grandi, Maurizio Cazzati, and Bartolomeo Montalban, composers who, although associated with Bologna, were active in other centers at the time of their publication. In this light, Degli Antoni's violin sonatas appear as the first purely Bolognese examples of the genre. At the time of Giuseppe Torelli's activity in Bologna, in addition to himself, the violin sonata was practiced by Giuseppe Iacchini, Clemente Giacomo Preghieri, Bartolomeo Bernardi, Carlo Mazzolini, and Bernardino Roz. Arcangelo Corelli's useful violin sonatas published in Buffagnotti's anthology or preserved in a Turin manuscript can also be added to this list. Before the publication of his first collection of violin sonatas, Pietro Degli Antoni was also actively involved in the field of solo violin suite, a genre that was more popular in Bologna than the sonata. as far as Bolognese works for solo violin are concerned, Pietro degli Antoni is the composer of the most numerous works. Enjoying a great respect during his lifetime as a composer, instrumentalist of San Petronio and Concerto Palatino, as well as maestro di cappella of many local churches, Pietro degli Antoni is today a forgotten composer. Although he was active in the field of many vocal and instrumental genres, his works are not readily played today. He is known virtually only for his violin sonatas, and that in a very limited way. Containing 12 pieces, the collection Sonata a violino solo con il basso continuo per l'organo, opus 4, by Pietro degli Antoni, was published in Bologna in 1676 and dedicated to Prince Giovanni Carlo Renuzzi, a representative of a well-known and respected family of Bolognese senators. 10 years later, a collection of Degli Antoni's 8 Sonate a violino solo con il basso continuo per l'organo, opus 5, was published, dedicated to Francesco II d'Este, Duke of Modena, a well-known violin lover. Judging by the small number of surviving copies, 2 for opus 4 and 3 for opus 5, both of these prints were not issued in a large numbers and enjoyed rather moderate interest outside Emilia Romagna. In addition, some opus 4 sonatas were included in the manuscript anthology of the British Library. A complete copy of the sonatas from opus 5, on the other hand, can be found in the manuscript of the Biblioteca Estense in Modena and the Marian Gymnasium Bibliothek in Jever, Germany. Today, we do not know what the purpose of the Antoni sonatas was. Opus 4 appeared in the first year he became Principe of the Accademia Filarmonica. The sonatas of Opus 5, on the other hand, were published in the same year that his oratorio Innocenza de Bressa was performed at the court of Francesco II d'Este. It can be assumed that the composer was in Modena at that time. On the title pages of the prints, Degli Antoni indicates his membership in 2 Bologna academies, Accademia dei Filaschisi and Accademia Filarmonica. We can assume, therefore, that these works were written with these academies or the Modena court in mind, where there were many violin virtuosos capable of performing them. Considering the style of these pieces and the organ accompaniment, we cannot exclude their performance during the annual celebration of the patronal feast of the Accademia Filarmonica, although it is more likely that there were sonatas of larger ensembles, for example his sonatas a tre. We do know that between 1674 and 1677, unspecified sinfonias by Pietro degli Antoni were played for the graduale during these festive academic masses, including one with cornetto as the solo instrument. Against the backdrop of all Bologna works, the violin sonatas by Pietro degli Antoni are not only the most numerous, but also the most original. They all belong to the violin organ sonata type. On the title pages of both collections, the accompanying instrument is clearly specified. Organ accompaniment was also required in the violin sonatas by degli Antoni's predecessors, associated with Bologna, Montalbano, Grandi and Cazzato. Bolognese composers active in the last quarter of the 17th century referred to the accompanying voice rather generally as basso continuo or violone or violoncello. The bass accompaniment was most often entrusted to the cello, which was in great demand in Bologna at that time. While the violin organ sonatas of Degli Antoni's predecessors are monodic in texture, in which, against the backdrop of the long note values of the bass, the melodic line of the violin clearly dominates without entering into motivic correspondences with the organ melody, the sonatas by Degli Antoni show a completely different type of shaping. The bass line here is very active. The organ not only initiates subject entries in imitation, but also often participate in concertante dialogues with the violin. This is already very reminiscent of the texture of violin and cello duets by Degli Antoni's younger colleagues, Torelli, Corelli, Iacchini, Predieri, Mazzolini, Rossi, and Bernardo. However, when the change of the accompanying instrument from organ to cello entailed the need to fill the harmony by both string instruments, and the violin sometimes play double or triple stops, we do not find any examples of chordal playing in Degli Antoni's sonatas. This is because, in terms of melodic language, Degli Antoni's sonatas are still influenced by the style prevailing in the first half of the 17th century. The starting point of the violin voice's melody is not a harmony and a chord, but the principles of modal counterpoint still prevail here, with the dominance of melodic motion in seconds occasionally interrupted by leaps. In this respect, Degli Antoni's sonatas from Opus 4 and 5 differ from his violin suites from Opus 1 and 3, where in the violin melody we find more broken chords and typical violin leaps over empty strings. Although violin-specific motifs are used in Opus 4 and 5, in several pieces both the melodic line, the avoidance of the lowest string register, and the range could just as well point to the cornetto as the solo instrument. This is interesting because the sources tell us little about Pietro degli Antoni's violinist skills, but we do know that he was a virtuoso of the cornetto. When it comes to the melody of Degli Antoni's violin sonatas, compared to the works of his Bologna colleagues, they are distinguished above all by the unique cantilena undoubtedly based on vocal patterns. Many of the middle movements of these works are titled Aria Grave, Aria Posata, Aria Vivace. Although his arias from Cantate da Camera Voce Sola, Opus 6, or the arias from his Oratorio Innocenza Depressa are also similarly titled, their confrontation revealed no borrowings, only some technical similarities. Paradoxically, the arias from violin sonatas seem even more tuneful than those from vocal works. Many times, the aria part of the sonata is based on the principle of motto aria. The composer also refers to the arioso style and recitative. Parts not marked as arias are also influenced by the vocal style, although it is difficult to find similar examples of inspiration from vocal genres in the sonata works of Bolognese composers. They were not so rare in Italian violin sonatas of the Degli Antoni era. Imitations of cantata melodics can be seen in the works of Giovanni Bonaventura Viviani, Giovanni Antonio Pandolfi Mealli, Alessandro Stradella, Carlo Manelli, or Agostino Guerrieri. Against the backdrop of the Bolognese works of the last quarter of the 17th century, Degli Antoni's violin sonatas are also distinguished by their original form. In the manners typical of sonatas of the second half of the 17th century, Degli Antoni's sonatas are already cyclic arrangements, built of 4 or 5 clearly distinguishable movements. However, in the case of several pieces from both collections, one can also notice multi-sectional heterogeneous structures with a clear expressive contrast and a smooth transition from one section to another, similar to Monte Albano sonatas. The 5 movement cycles slightly outnumber the 4 movement cycles, 58% in Opus 4 and 62 in Opus 5. It can be treated as a preview of Opus 5 by Torelli, in which all 6 sonatas from Parte Prima and 5 are 5 movement arrangements. Unlike the classic of Baroque sonata from Torelli and the Bolognese composers, whose sonatas consist of a quantitatively balanced succession of slow and fast movements, Degli Antoni follows his own path and experiments a lot. The most original feature of his sonatas is a marked tendency to overuse slow movements. In extreme cases, 3 of the 4 movements are slow, or the first 3 movements are slow. While in sonatas written in the first half of the 17th century, usually one of the inner movements was kept in a triple meter, in sonatas from both collections, Degli Antoni often introduced different triple meters in 2 movements. Forms composed of 2 triple movements are also observed in violin sonatas by Corelli, Preghieri, Rozzi, and Bernard. The greater presence of movements in triple meters is related to the process of hybridization of the Da Chiesa and Da Camera sonata characteristic of the last quarter of the 17th century. A fugal or freely imitative movement is present in almost every Degli Antoni sonata. The greater melodic involvement of the organ mentioned above is precisely due to the frequent presence of imitative counterpoint. The sonatas of Opus 4 are among the first in the violin literature to feature regular fugues, even with 4 or 5 sections, 4 entries of the subjects, strettos and concertante episodes. Where in Opus 4 the composer introduced only 1 fugal movement in a sonata, in Opus 5 there are pieces with 2 fugues. Perhaps this change was dictated by the impact of the Corellian sonata model with 2 fugues, where 2 fugues were known. When in Corelli's sonatas fugues occur in the 2nd and 4th movements, in Degli Antoni's works, again, the form surprises the listener. They can be placed in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th movement. Comparing the fugues of Opus 4 and 5, one can notice a certain melodic evolution of the subjects, where the subjects of the fugues from Opus 4 are older and usually operate with canzona motifs. In Opus 5, there are more modern extended andamento types. The subject of the final fugue of the Opus 5, number 8 sonata even resembles the ritornello motto of Torelli's Sinfonia for trumpet, G4. The Antoni's sonatas are among the highly original works also because of their tonal language. Within the collection, each sonata is in a different key. According to the currents of the era, there are various types of transpositions of the Aeolian and Ionian modes. In both collections, there is an almost perfect balance between minor and major notes. Looking looking at the tonal order of Opus 4, one can see that the first 8 sonatas are based on finales corresponding numerically to the system of 8 church modes, while for the full dozen, the composer includes various transpositions of Ionian or Aeolian modes. An even wider range of such transpositions is presented in the sonatas of Opus 5, where the sonata quarta is in the key of B minor, which was still very rare at that time. While most of the sonatas from the second half of the 17th century are based on a similar system of 6 or 7 modes, described by Bononcini in his Musico Pratico, I mean D, E, A, G minor modes and F, G and C major, Degli Antoni only in Opus 4 and 5 uses as many as 13 keys. Such a choice is already very similar to the system of 15 keys used by Johann Sebastian Bach or Antonio Vivaldi in the first half of the 18th century. A rich tonal language also prevails in the melodics of Degli Antoni's sonatas. At times, the composer uses as many as 6 sharps in a single work. Particularly, often in order to increase expression, he uses leaps with various types of intervalli. The tendency to use this type of leaps can be seen as another example of the influence of vocal music. The imitative subjects with a characteristic diminished form that begins the sonata number 2, opus 5, coincides with the similarly imitative opening of Maria Magdalena's aria Care Membra from the second part of the oratorio Innocenza Depressa. Both works were written at the same time in 1686. In terms of violin technique, the sonatas of Degli Antoni are not among the works as virtuosic as those by Torelli, Bernardi or Corelli. However, most of them require a very wide range by 17th century standards. Due to the emphasis on cantilena and the linear conduct of the violin melody in imitative or concertante exchanges with the organ, Degli Antoni's sonatas lack chordal playing, arpeggio, or variolage technique. The composer apparently adhered to the dominant practice in 17th century Italy of modeling the violin part on singing, avoiding chordal or polyphonic playing in favor of building beautiful, elaborated melodies and linear figurations. The works by his Bolognese predecessors, Montalbano, Grandi and Cazzati, as well as some of his successors, like Giacomo Predieri, Carlo Mazzolini and Giuseppe Iacchini, belong to a similar type of violin sonata. Corelli's useful violin sonatas, the sonata from Turin manuscript and the first sonata from Buffagnoti's anthology, are also devoid of violin polyphony. In Degli Antoni's sonatas, we find a bow vibrato called tremolo con arco, already not very well known today. The technique from the jar, the bow. This technique was characteristic of 17th century music. In order to diversify the 16-note figuration in 2 melody planes, the composer uses a tremolo. As one of the few Italian violinists of his era, he introduces staccato notes. He is no stranger to trombetta-type figurations characteristic of Modena violinists, or perfidia figurations typical of the Bologna school. Degli Antoni's sonatas are among the first in which one can speak of idiomatic semi-quaver figurations for the violin. His sonatas are moderately difficult when it comes to playing in high positions. Due to the high notes on the E string, the composer requires playing in the 5th position, while as early as the first half of the 17th century, Uccellini's sonatas had to use the 7th position. The type of violin organ sonata practiced by Degli Antoni in the Torelli era was slowly becoming a thing of the past. In addition to Degli Antoni, in Italy it was still practiced by Antonio Veracini, Giovanni Bonaventura Viviani, Agostino Guerrieri and Isabella Leonardo. A peculiarity of Bologna at the time of the 17th and 18th centuries was rather the cultivation of violin and cello duos, and both outstanding violinists and cellists were active here. It was also to this tradition that Torelli referred in his Opus 5, which is a model for a violin sonata commonly reproduced in the first decade of the 18th century. Against this Bolognese backdrop, Pietro degli Antoni's sonatas appear as works that, on the one hand, continue the tradition of the monodic sonata, typical of the first half of the 17th century, and at the same time already foreshadowing the violin and cello duos so characteristic of the late Bologna school. Degli Antoni's violin sonatas thus stand on the borderline of two musical worlds. And that is why they are so interesting and worth performing them today. Thank you.
Thank you, Pietro, for this deep immersion in Pietro degli Antoni's solo sonata for violin. We are late, so we have just time for 1 or 2 questions. Any comments? Please.
Thanks for this great paper. I was wondering, thinking about Felicori's work, if the absence of double stops and chordal playing, which I saw in the manuscript you showed, could be, besides the fact that he was also a cornetto player, maybe a consequence of the limitations of the multi-type printing techniques at that point.
Yeah, Peter also wrote years ago an article dedicated to this problem, and I responded to him with my article. According to me, yeah, this limitation of posso parlare italiano? According to me, this limitation was not the reason. If we have such a violinist, Italian violinist, who traveled to the German-speaking countries like Farina, Capriccio Stravagante, like Marini, sonatas from Opus 8, they could find the way to print their music with chords, with double stops. But the Marini example is very, very interesting because he calls these sonatas, a very limited number of such sonatas with chordal playing. He calls them in the printing, Didascalia, Curiose Invenzioni. And in one sonata there is a subtitle that the violino plays in modo di lira. So, according to me, for Italians, Germans played violin in a lira mode, not like Italians who were more interested in following the singing example. We don't have so many manuscripts with solo violin music from Italy, but these few that we have are that they don't have chordal playing. And according to me, also the model of Italian sonata up to the 60s, 70s, or 80s, depends on the city, was rather the monodic sonata, This kind of sonata gave great freedom to the violinists, but there was no need to fail in harmony. The situation was changed here in Bologna with the generation of Giuseppe Torelli. First, we can observe the kind of hybridization of the Chiesa and the camera sonata, so that means that there were more influence from dances, but also that means that we have more sonatas for violin and cello than violin and organ. And like we may assume that some cellists could realize the harmony, also the violinists had to do it. When the cello had figurations, the violin had to fill the harmony. We can observe it in Opus 5 by Torelli. And this Torelli, in his young sonatas from his youthful times in Turin manuscript and in Carlo Fagnotti's anthology, also doesn't use chordal playing, but there were no limitations of movable tab rings. So, according to me, the reasons were more aesthetics than technical. Surely, many Italian violinists could realize violin polyphony, but here in Italy, it probably was not so. How we call it? It was not fashion. Appreciate it. Thank you.
In connection to this, I switch to Italian, it's easier for me. Potrebbe anche avere a che fare, mi convince abbastanza l'idea di modelli estetici che orientano la scrittura, perché le possibilità tecniche c'erano, no? Penso. Potrebbe anche avere a che fare con l'ambito di fruizione della musica, queste sonate più per un ambito ecclesiastico, diciamo, perché ancora magari nel XVII secolo esistono questi orientamenti verso un legame più stretto, diciamo, tra scelte formali, stilistiche formali e ambito di funzione e fruizione della musica. Potrebbe avere a che fare anche con quello, perché naturalmente questo nel XVIII è già tutto un altro discorso, no? Abbiamo molto più virtuosismo anche, insomma, in concerti da chiesa che sappiamo che sono veramente stati eseguiti in ambito liturgico, diciamo.
Sì, è vero, vorrei anche aggiungere che in Bologna noi abbiamo le nostre sonate seicentesche per violino, che tutte sono conservate nei manoscritti, perché infatti non esisteva la stampa musicale in Bologna nel 500 sì, ma poi no. Loro sono molto italianizzate e sono prive delle piccole della polifonia, anche se siamo vicini dai tedeschi. Sì. Allora le scelte estetiche decidevano, secondo me, e la maggior parte delle sonate polacche sono scritte per l'ambiente ecclesiastico.
Bene, grazie Torelli Wilk, e a questo punto c'è un coffee break, siamo un po' in ritardo, diciamo che possiamo fare la pausa ora e poi ricominciare alle 12:15. Grazie.